Imagine this. You are standing in a room pulsing with conversation, chandeliers trembling under the collective laughter, glass after glass colliding in fragile toasts. Yet despite the glittering buzz, you notice the pattern. An empty chair in every animated circle, a small erasure where the brightest mind should be. No one mentions it out loud, but you feel the outline of an absence as sharply as a draft under the door. Why does the person whose thoughts can dissect the cosmos choose instead to disappear into the quiet corridors of their own head? Now tilt the scene toward yourself. Recall the last time someone tried to pull you into the swirl of weekend plans, happy hours, networking dinners. A split-second flash of obligation crossed your mind. But what followed was not excitement. It was something closer to resistance, even nausea. You fumbled for a credible excuse, retreated to the safety of your interior kingdom, and felt a strange mix of guilt and relief. What is that dissonance inside you? Why does the promise of connection feel suspiciously like a trap? Pause here. Have you ever wondered whether the social arena, so universally celebrated, is secretly structured against the very people most equipped to interrogate it? The smarter you become, the sharper your sensitivity to the hidden scaffolding of banal chatter, the predictable scripts, the covert status games, the conversational potholes that swallow nuance. Is your withdrawal a personal flaw, or a rational refusal to play a rigged game? Consider the paradox. Human beings are branded as inherently social animals. Isolation, we're told, is psychological starvation. But then why do some of the most cognitively agile and arguably happiest moments occur when you are utterly alone, chasing a thought into uncharted territory? Could it be that intelligence, like a double-edged blade, cuts away the comforting fabric of social myths, exposing how thin it truly is? Ask yourself, when you enter a party, do you feel an invisible questionnaire floating above every head? What do you do? How much do you earn? Are you interesting enough to validate my presence? And do you feel your own mind recoiling, whispering, there must be more to us than this marketplace of attention? If the answer is yes, does that mean you are broken or frighteningly awake? Notice the accompanying unease. If you continue to avoid these gatherings, will you slip into irrelevance, a hermit orbiting the edges of a loud world? But if you force yourself to mingle, do you risk betraying your inner compass, draining the battery that powers your originality? Which loss is greater, the erosion of social ties or the erosion of the self? Here's the real sting. Society often romanticizes the lone genius in retrospect, while pathologizing solitude in real time. They praise the reclusive philosopher after the masterpiece is published. They call the living thinker antisocial the night before. Could it be that the very detachment condemned today is the crucible from which tomorrow's breakthroughs emerge? And if so, why do we cling to the stigma anyway? You might feel the walls of convention pressing closer now, insisting that you must choose. Join the crowd and dilute your edge, or guard your mind and risk loneliness. But what if this is a false binary? A choice engineered by deeper forces that thrive on your compliance? What if the so-called antisocial impulse is actually a survival mechanism for mental clarity in a culture addicted to noise? Let the tension settle in your chest for a moment. Feel the question tightening, like a knot you can't yet untie. Why do intelligent people, why do you instinctively recoil from the very stage where society claims life is performed? Is it cowardice, arrogance, or could it be a subtle form of wisdom that most have forgotten how to hear? Hold that unease, because before we can name the answer, we must map the terrain beneath it. The psychological tectonics, the philosophical undertow, the silent bargains embedded in every invitation we accept or decline. Only then can we decide whether to step forward or to burn the stage entirely. So take a breath. Look back at that empty chair in the crowded room and realize it isn't simply vacant. It is an exclamation mark. The absence is speaking, and it is pointing directly at you. The real question is no longer, why don't smart people socialize? It is, what unseen machinery makes retreat the most intelligent move? Stay with that thought, because the descent into those hidden gears is where our journey truly begins. Peer beneath the polished floorboards of everyday chatter, and you will find an older architecture, one that predates cocktail parties and campus mixers, one etched into the collective unconscious that C.G. Jung spent his life mapping. You sense it each time you hover at the edge of a gathering, an archetypal drama in which every participant must wear a mask, a persona designed for the common world. You, however, cannot ignore the faint hum behind the curtain, the reminder that the persona is only a paper lantern shielding the raw nuclear core of the psyche. Why does that hum grow louder the smarter you become? Because intelligence sharpens perception, and a sharper perception detects the seams in any costume. The brighter your lantern, the more obvious its fragility, and the less willing you are to pretend the paper is iron. Push deeper, and Friedrich Nietzsche's shadow appears, whispering from the abyss. He who has a why can bear almost any how. In rooms saturated with small talk, the why often evaporates, leaving only an endless shuffle of how. How to smile, how to nod, how to appear engaged. Your intellect is an unruly beast. It starves on such fare. It demands ultimate questions, cosmic stakes, the taste of raw meaning. When that demand collides with a buffet of social pleasantries, nausea is inevitable. Call it arrogance if you wish, but the deeper truth is metaphysical hunger, and ordinary interaction offers only breadcrumbs. Arthur Schopenhauer, that chronic pessimist, once likened social life to porcupines huddling for warmth. Too close, we wound one another. Too far, we freeze. You recognize the spikes protruding from polite smiles, subtle barbs of comparison, status calibration, transactional interest. The cleverer the mind, the more acutely it feels each quill. You step back, not to declare yourself superior, but to avoid a pain your nervous system registers with higher resolution. Evolution gifted you a sensitive instrument. It punishes rough handling. Yet something stranger still lies underneath. Michel Foucault argues that every society is a machine for normalizing behavior, an apparatus that codifies what is speakable and silent. The brighter your cognition, the easier you notice the gears. Questions no one asks. Truths politely exiled. Entire continents of thought fenced off by invisible laws. Your retreat, then, is not cowardice but civil disobedience. Each silence is a tiny refusal. I will not lend my voice to this ritual of forgetfulness. Notice how the pattern scales. At the micro level, you dodge the after-work drinks. At the macro level, entire intellectual lineages break away from mainstream culture, forming monastic orders, underground salons, lonely garret rooms lit by a single lamp. History's most potent ideas often gestate in these borderlands, because only there can a mind think without the iron filings of consensus distorting its compass. The question is not why you withdraw, but why anyone still expects originality to bloom in the hothouse of perpetual togetherness. A psychologist might label your impulse social anhedonia, a pathological lack of pleasure in group settings. But flip the lens and another explanation emerges. It is cognitive saturation. High bandwidth minds process stimuli quickly. Conversation that drips along at baseline speed feels like throttling a fiber optic cable down to dial-up. You are not disengaged. You are buffering, forced to idle while the room catches up. Frustration is inevitable, and so is avoidance. Then there is memory. You carry libraries of previous dialogues, run statistical models on them, without noticing. Predict the next 10 minutes of polite exchange with grim accuracy. Where surprise dies, curiosity suffocates, and where curiosity suffocates, presence becomes unsustainable. Your ghost leaves the circle long before your body makes an excuse to follow. But beware, the psyche abhors a vacuum. When you exit the stage, an explanatory myth rushes in to fill the gap. You're shy, aloof, intimidating, maybe even misanthropic. Society rarely grants the possibility that your absence is a philosophical stance. Labeling it a flaw keeps the machinery intact. If too many people recognized the script and tore it up, the chorus would falter. The play would collapse. And no one knows what would rise from the rubble. Here is the deepest layer, the one even Jung approached with caution: individuation. Intelligence is not merely the ability to solve problems. It is the gravitational pull toward wholeness, the integration of shadow, anima, self. That journey is solitary by design. When you converse, fragments of you must remain on mute so the dialogue can flow. In solitude, the full choir of inner voices may finally rehearse together. Thus, your retreat is not an escape from people, but a pilgrimage toward totality. If this is true, the stakes are existential. Every invitation becomes a forked path. Accept and risk diluting the alchemical processes. Decline and risk spectral isolation. You hover at the threshold like the mythical hermit sage, knowing that one step could cost you an epiphany, while the other might erode your very humanity. No algorithm can optimize this. It is an hour-to-hour negotiation with your own becoming. Now feel the vertigo. Perhaps the social world, as we currently stage it, is simply not engineered for minds tuned to deeper frequencies. Perhaps what appears as personal idiosyncrasy is a structural mismatch between the tempo of civilization and the cadence of authentic thought. If so, the usual advice, just put yourself out there, is not merely unhelpful. It is a category error, like urging a deep-sea diver to breathe shallower because the surface air is abundant. Where does that leave you? Hovering in a chiaroscuro zone, half inside and half outside the tribe, translating between the language of mirrors and the language of depths. You suspect that another model of communion must exist, one spacious enough to hold silence, complexity, and the unscripted flash of genuine insight, but you have not yet seen it grow in the wild, and the search itself can feel like wandering an empty desert with only a compass of intuition. Before we forge that alternative, we must confront a darker question. What are the hidden costs of staying out of the game? Loneliness is not the only specter. There are subtler debts accruing in your blind spots, shaping your destiny even as you congratulate yourself on your independence. To see those debts, you must lift a different veil, one that covers consequences so quiet you almost forget they exist. Hold your breath. The next step down will not be gentle, but it is the only way to measure the true price of your chosen solitude. Turn the lens from motives to outcomes, and a subtler terrain rises. One you rarely chart, because its landmarks hide in peripheral vision. You think solitude is a private negotiation between self-preservation and social expectation. But every decision to stay home radiates outward like shockwaves through still water, shaping currents you only notice years later. Start with your own neural circuitry. The prefrontal cortex thrives on complexity. Yes, yet the social brain, those mirror neuron networks that calibrate empathy, nuance, timing, atrophies without exercise. You sense yourself becoming a sharper thinker and a duller conversationalist, a mind honed like a scalpel, but a tongue sheathed in rust. Is that a fair trade? Perhaps, until the day you need to transmit that brilliance to someone who controls a resource you lack. Funding, collaboration, even simple companionship. Then the words jam like paper in a printer, and you watch an entire possibility crumble because your delivery system can't keep pace with your ideas. Did your intellect betray you, or did your retreat slowly unplug the cables you now desperately need? Zoom out one layer. Reputation, like sediment, builds gradually, each interaction depositing a grain of perceived value. Opt out often enough, and the very absence becomes your signature. People project myths into the vacuum. Aloof, unreliable, maybe dangerous. Future invitations vanish before they are spoken. You believe you chose aloneness, but eventually the world chooses it for you, calcifying the walls you once thought portable. By the time you notice, you are not stepping outside a circle. The circle has closed, and you are the negative space left behind. Now consider innovation itself. Sociologist Mark Granovetter calls it the strength of weak ties. Breakthroughs leap across the lattice of acquaintance, not best friends. Each time you dodge a casual meetup, you sever a potential bridge for an idea, still looking for its missing piece. The patent you almost co-authored, the theory you almost refined, the revolution you almost accelerated, all ghost drafts in a parallel timeline. Your solitude was fertile, yes, but fertility without cross-pollination produces rare orchids no one else can taste. The stakes climb higher when culture enters the room. In a noisy society, volume often substitutes for insight. Extroverted certainty drowns out quiet accuracy. When the most perceptive minds withdraw, the epistemic commons tilts toward theatrics. Decisions in boardrooms, laboratories, parliaments lean on the confident rather than the correct. You worry about your personal trajectory, but the collective trajectory bends too. Policy shaped without your caveats, technology launched without your ethical foresight. Every seat you leave vacant is filled by a louder, simpler story. Multiply that vacancy by thousands of reticent thinkers, and you see how civilizations drift toward calamities that quieter wisdom might have tempered. Drill down into cognitive biases, and the tableau grows darker. Humans overvalue information delivered face-to-face. Absence, meanwhile, breeds availability bias in reverse. What is unseen is undervalued. Your insights, no matter how decisive, lose weight when they float in asynchronous text, stripped of vocal timbre and eye contact. Gradually, even you begin to doubt their heft. Confirmation bias whispers that if your ideas mattered, the world would request them. It doesn't, so they must not. A self-fulfilling slide into muted potential unfolds, elegant and invisible. There is also the affect heuristic. Emotion shortcuts judgment. Shared laughter at a mediocre joke builds goodwill that later shields mistakes. Your austere brilliance enters negotiations with no such buffer. People remember how you made them feel more than what you made them think. And feelings require proximity. By opting out, you exceed that subtle battlefield entirely, leaving logic to dual sentiment on an equal footing. But the consequences are not only social. They seep into the architecture of your inner life. The hippocampus encodes memories more vividly in varied contexts. 6 months alone at your desk can blur into a single gray corridor of time, while an afternoon argument in a crowded cafe etches itself in high definition. Thus, paradoxically, the more hours you reclaim, the fewer distinct memories you accrue, compressing your personal narrative into a minimalist timeline. You gain depth at the cost of texture, mastery at the cost of story. Evolutionary biologists warn of runaway selection, traits amplified until they become liabilities. Peacocks grow tails so ornate they hinder flight. Minds can grow analysis so ornate they hinder adaptation. Your capacity to model complexity may spiral without the ballast of lived frictions, leaving you exquisitely calibrated for problems that occur only in theory. Meanwhile, Life's messy stochastic variables, another person's pause, a misheard word, a sudden rainstorm, become glitches in your otherwise pristine simulation, causing disproportionate distress. Culture senses your discomfort and offers digital palliatives, algorithmic echo chambers where you can converse with curated replicas of yourself. You call it community, but it is communion with a hall of mirrors. Each reflection confirms your worldview, sanding away the abrasion that once sparked unconscious learning. In those echoing halls, your biases merge with software's profit motive, crystallizing into ideological armor, so smooth that counter-evidence slides off without a trace. Only when an external crisis pierces the shell do you feel the cost of that simulated safety. Meanwhile, the marketplace of advantage keeps score. Promotions, grants, even friendships often flow through networks of reciprocity. Tiny favors accumulated in unplanned corridors, holding an elevator, offering a cigarette, laughing at the right moment. You skip the corridor. You avoid the elevator. You never carry cigarettes. The ledger stays blank. And when you finally require a favor, the algorithm of social math returns a null value. You might call it superficial, but the system is indifferent to your critique. It runs on accumulated sparks of presence, not intellectual merit. Pause and sense the paradox tightening. The very instinct meant to protect your cognitive integrity can erode the conditions that allow that integrity to influence the world, or even to survive intact. Like a star collapsing under its own gravity, the intellect without relational counter-pressure risks imploding into solipsism, a private singularity no light escapes. Does this mean you must fling yourself back into every invitation, dilute your solitude until it tastes like everyone else's Tuesday? Not yet. Solutions remain premature. The wound must be fully mapped before suturing. For now, acknowledge the unseen toll. Neuronal, reputational, cultural, evolutionary. Quiet debits accumulating interest in the dim corners of your life ledger. Feel that shiver? It is the realization that isolation is never a zero-cost transaction. Wisdom demands solitude, yes, but solitude exacts a fee payable in currencies you may not notice until the debt collector knocks late at night, disguised as regret, irrelevance, or a crisis no single mind can solve alone. Hold that recognition. Let it run its fingers along the walls you built and ask, are they shelter or are they prison bars? The answer is not yet obvious, but the question now has teeth. And once the question bites, complacency begins to bleed. There is danger in staying where you are, yet danger too in returning blindly to the crowd. The only sane move is a rebellion more nuanced than simple withdrawal or surrender, a redesign of the very grammar of connection. But before rebellion, a blueprint. Before blueprint, a spark of daring to imagine alternatives. Stay awake. The revolt against the invisible cage is about to begin, but only if you are willing to dismantle assumptions as ruthlessly as you once dismantled small talk. You have mapped the prison, its cell bars woven from expedition, its air thick with unspoken debts. Good. Now light the first match. But understand, this rebellion will not mimic the noisy upheavals of history. It will move with the precision of a watchmaker dismantling gears one click at a time. The enemy is not other people. It is the unconscious script that convinces you to either vanish or conform. Your task is to write a third act nobody has staged before. Step 1. Redraw the circle. Begin by refusing the default geometry of social life, the crowded ring where voices jostle for traction. Instead, design micro-arenas calibrated to your bandwidth. Host a midnight salon with 3 curious strangers and a single outrageous question. What idea could destroy everything we presume about reality? The smallness is deliberate. Intimacy compresses surface talk out of existence. Within minutes, The conversation tilts into the marrow, and you notice something startling. Your intellect feels invited instead of encumbered. You are not anti-social. You are anti-superficial. Craft settings that confirm this. Step 2. Instrumentalize your silence. Solitude is your forge. Keep it, but give it ports and conduits. Set weekly exposure windows where you surface with one distilled insight. No more, no less, and offer it freely to a community you respect. Think of it as intellectual photosynthesis. Periods of dark synthesis followed by brief bursts of illumination. Over time, those pulses create a recognizable signal, and the world learns when to tune in. You stay sovereign, yet you re-enter the commons on your own terms. Step 3. Hack reciprocity. Remember the blank social ledger? Fill it with asymmetric gifts that cost little time, but carry high resonance. Email a marginalized poet whose work no algorithm will surface. Archive and share a dataset a junior researcher can't afford. Annotate a public code repo with a single line that saves strangers hours of debugging. Reciprocity need not bloom in cocktail bars. It can grow in quiet acts of precision generosity. The ledger updates. The network activates. Your absence no longer reads as disengagement, but as disciplined stewardship. Step 4. Adopt the one conversation rule. Demand of yourself one profound dialogue each week with someone outside your cognitive echo chamber. A nurse, a sculptor, a climate activist. Approach with militant curiosity. Interrogate their worldview until you discover a pattern your models fail to predict. This is not networking. It is cross-pollination as spiritual practice. You will leave the exchange humming with micro-mutations in perspective. Exactly the genetic diversity your thought ecosystem needs to avoid intellectual inbreeding. Step 5. Reclaim the body. Intelligence often retreats upward, sailing into the cerebral loft, leaving the body as unattended scaffolding. Drag it back into the equation. Sign up for a movement discipline that confounds your preferred logic. Improv dance, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, free climbing. Physical risk recalibrates your threat matrix. Tactile feedback punctures perfectionism. In those kinetic crucibles, you relearn rapport without words, attuned to microsignals of breath and weight. Later, when you re-enter dialogue, your empathy channels run clearer, less prone to intellectual override. Step 6. Prototype public vulnerability. Perfection is the cloaking device of the gifted. Strip it off. Publish a half-formed thesis. Label it version 0.3. Invite demolition. The act feels like stepping on stage naked, but vulnerability is viral. Respectful challengers appear, lured by the permission to think aloud. What emerges is not the brittle applause of finished work, but a living commons of iterative insight. In that churn, your ideas acquire antibodies, and you learn that exposure need not entail dilution, only maturation. Step 7. Invert the status game. Traditional social arenas rank players on charisma, wealth, novelty. Rewrite the scoreboard. Award highest status to quality of listening. In every interaction, aim to become the person who hears the sentence beneath the sentence. Watch what happens. People recalibrate in real time, mirroring your attention with deeper disclosure. The conversation quickens, clichés shed like husks, and suddenly, the room contains the complexity you once found only in solitude. You have not escaped the game. You have reskinned it. Historical proof of concept. Recall Baruch Spinoza, grinding lenses in near-penniless exile, yet maintaining a tight correspondence circle that ricocheted through Enlightenment Europe. Or Ada Lovelace, who balanced Victorian salons with midnight mathematics, her algorithmic prophecy born at the hinge of society and solitude. More recently, consider James Baldwin in a 1960s Paris cafe. drafting letters that detonated across the Atlantic. Each forged a custom interface: selective gatherings, disciplined withdrawal, public vulnerability. They were neither hermits nor social butterflies. They were architects of liminal space. Psychological payoff. Engaging on your own architecture lowers the cognitive tax of social masking, freeing executive function for creative leaps. Exposure windows prevent atrophy of mirror neurons, sustaining empathetic agility. Asymmetric gifts generate goodwill deposits that buffer future friction. Re-embodied practice grounds you against runaway abstraction. The ledger flips. What once drained you now amortizes into a renewable resource. Societal ripple. When enough high-bandwidth minds adopt this tactical rebellion, the fabric of discourse shifts. Conferences evolve into hybrid labs, offices into idea guilds, online spaces into public ateliers. Noise still exists, but islands of deep exchange proliferate, and policy begins to absorb nuance that only complexity-fluent thinkers can supply. Civilization gains a cybernetic upgrade, the wisdom of solitude injected back into the bloodstream of the collective. Guardrails against drift. Yet rebellion dies without maintenance. Schedule quarterly audits. Are your micro-arenas devolving into echo chambers? Has the ledger of gifts slipped back to zero? Are you still practicing embodied risk, or has the comfort of mastery numbed you? The prison will rebuild itself the moment vigilance sleeps. Make ritual of review. Make review a celebration. And what of loneliness? It lingers, yes, but changes timbre, from hollow ache to resonant hush, the silence of a studio before the brush meets canvas. You may still decline the party, yet when you do, you know why. And the ledger of unseen costs no longer accrues compound interest in the dark. Feel the shift? The walls are not gone, but they have turned to paper. One measured breath could blow them outward into an open-ended architecture only you can draft. The rebellion is not loud, but it is systemic, and it begins each dawn. You choose design over default. Hold that blueprint in your palm, ink still wet, dared into existence by your refusal to accept the binary. The final step is coming, the revelation that collapses the scaffolding of every lesser question. But first, let the sparks of this insurgency glow in the dark, tracing the outlines of a freedom you can already taste. When you are ready to ignite the last fuse, we will step into the chamber where ultimate answers wait, patient and humming. Picture yourself alone on a summit at 4:30 in the morning. A hard wind knives across the ridge, carving gullies in the cloud bank below. You have climbed here to escape the static of other voices, yet as dawn leaks over the horizon, an unsettling realization burns through you. There is no such thing as owie. Every atom in your lungs was once exhaled by strangers. Every concept in your head is a salvage from languages you did not invent. Even up here, breathing solitude, you are inhaling the residue of millions of vanished conversations. That is the crack in the stone, where the ultimate truth glints. Separation and connection are not opposites. They are phases of the same current. Solitude is not a vacuum, but a transformer. It lowers the voltage of the collective, so your individual circuits can safely reorganize those ties. Sociality, meanwhile, is not a swarm that steals your signal. It is the grid that releases your stored charge back into the world. You have spent years oscillating between withdrawal and compliance because you believed they were mutually exclusive. The deeper reality is electromagnetic. One field, two polarities, endlessly converting into each other. Everything changes once you grasp this. The empty chair at the party and the blank page in your study are portals to the same dimension, a living commons where minds cross-pollinate through time as well as space. When you seclude yourself to sculpt an insight, You are already in dialogue with ancestors, with algorithms, with unborn readers whose future astonishment haunts the edges of your sentence. And when you enter a room full of bodies, your private intuitions slip invisibly among them, seeking the pattern that only collective heat can reveal. The divide was never outside. It was the lens through which you interpreted the flow. Look backward. Every stage of human evolution has required this pulse. The lone hunter mapped stars in silence. The tribe gathered to trade myth for survival. The monk illuminated manuscripts in stone corridors. The city later took those illuminations and birthed the Renaissance. The coder writes in a dark room. The network deploys the code across continents. In milliseconds. Intelligence flowers in solitude, but is pollinated by contact, and the fruit feeds futures you might never witness. Now flip the camera inward. The multiplicity you once projected onto society has always lived inside you. Critical voice, dreaming voice, wounded child, feral visionary. Your psyche is already a parliament, each sub-self lobbying for airtime. External conversations merely extend that parliament into the open air. There is no showdown between inner and outer. There is only the skill of modulation, knowing when to mute one frequency so another can sing. Here lies the ultimate world-tilting insight. The most intelligent act is not to minimize contact, but to master resonance. You can tune any exchange, crowded conference or 2 a.m. kitchen talk, by choosing which internal delegate steps forward. Summon the cartographer when the terrain is unknown, the jester when tension knots the room, the skeptic when consensus turns syrupy. Performed with awareness, this is not masking, it is orchestration. You remain authentic because you are not a single instrument. You are the entire symphony choosing its conductor moment by moment. Notice what collapses when you accept this. Loneliness loses its narrative teeth. It becomes simply the quiet measure between beats. FOMO, that anxious itch for every missed gathering, dissolves too, because you recognize each absence as a deliberate rest that shapes the melody. Even the fear of irrelevance softens. Relevance is not constant broadcast, but precise contribution. The guitar riff that electrifies the song only because it enters at bar 27 and exits at bar 32. With this reframing, the costs mapped earlier do not vanish, but they become negotiable. Neural circuits grow through rhythmic use, alternate deep work with deliberate communion, and both intellect and empathy strengthen in tandem. Reputational sediment still accumulates, yet a single well-timed high-fidelity appearance can lay down strata worth months of dull visibility. The innovation lattice still favors weak ties, but you now enter chosen intersections as a catalyst, not a reluctant guest, carrying solvent ideas that crack problems open. And culture? When enough people master resonance, discourse itself evolves. Public squares fragment less into shouting booths because participants sense when to drop volume, when to amplify nuance. Policy debates inherit the cadence of jazz, call and response, solo and ensemble, rather than the monotony of sloganeering. A civilization tuned this way would not cancel solitude. It would weave solitude into its architecture, the way lungs weave exhalation into inhalation. What does this mean for the next decision you face? RSVP or decline, speak or stay silent, retreat or advance? It means the question is obsolete. Ask instead, which resonance does this moment require? And which facet of me can supply it without fracturing the core? Sometimes the answer will still be absence, a sacred no that protects gestation. Other times it will be a yes that rings like struck crystal, irreversible, unmistakable. Let the dawn on that summit complete its climb. The first direct ray ignites the valley floor, revealing roads, houses, sleeping strangers, all the lives threaded into yours whether you choose to acknowledge them or not. You realize the sunrise is not outside defeats you. Photosynthetic atoms in your blood remember exploding in the heart of another star. Connection is older than thought, older than species. You were born plugged in. What you call isolation is merely the mind closing its eyes to recalibrate the brilliance. So descend the mountain, not as a penitent returning to duty, but as a compositor, carrying new stems to splice into the collective track. Where you step, silence travels with you like an instrument case. Where you speak, quiet chords glimmer beneath the words, proof that the summit is still humming inside your chest. And where you fall, others will lift the melody because the score is communal. Every mind is a movable bridge between the unheard and the sung. Walk now knowing the choice was never solitude or society. The true frontier is stewardship of the flux itself. Guard your alone time with fierce devotion. Guard shared time with equal reverence. Each informs the other. The way night shapes the honesty of dawn. When you reach the city's edge and the first commuter passes, listen, not to their small talk, but to the counter-melody coiling beneath it. The still-forming idea only you can tease out, polish, and return. That, finally, is why the smartest people seem unwell. Not because they fear people, but because they are apprenticed to a deeper conversation that includes everyone, whether they hear it or not. And you are now both apprentice and master. Every breath is an invitation to tune the unseen orchestra. The next note is yours.